What is the very first thing you own when you enter this world? And the very last thing that remains when you leave it? Before you learned how to think, before you formed a single memory, and long before you understood what it meant to have an ego, a specific combination of acoustic syllables was assigned to your existence. It was stamped onto a piece of paper, whispered over your cradle, and woven into the fabric of your waking life. Your name. We treat it as a passive convenience, a social utility designed to separate your physical body from the billions of other bodies navigating this crowded planet. It is the practical tag we answer to in crowded rooms, the signature we write on legal documents, and the title carved into the stone when our breath finally fails. We look at our name as a mirror of our identity. But what if your name is not a mirror at all, but a perimeter wall? If you sit in absolute silence and repeat your own name over and over again, dozens, hundreds of times, a strange psychological phenomenon begins to occur. The familiar syllables start to decay. The intimate connection between those sounds and the person you believe you are completely snaps. You are left staring at a raw, alien vibration. In that jarring moment of clarity, a chilly question emerges from the dark. Who is the vast, unnameable observer that is listening to the collapse of its own title? Modern cognitive linguistics and quantum physics hint at an unsettling possibility. Human consciousness is inherently fluid, non-local, and infinite in its capacity to experience reality. Yet, the moment we attach a rigid, specific linguistic sound wave to this infinite potential, we collapse it. We trap a boundless consciousness inside a narrow, localized frequency. Your name is the primary frequency cage, the psychological sorting mechanism that forces an infinite self to pretend it is just one single identity. What if the word you use to define yourself is actually the very thing preventing you from discovering what you truly are? To understand the nature of this linguistic confinement, we must first dismantle our deep, unexamined bias toward the spoken word. We live in a civilization that prioritizes language above all other forms of expression. We use it to map the stars, codify laws, and translate our deepest emotional agonies into neat, structured paragraphs. We treat language as a tool of revelation, a mechanism that uncovers the hidden patterns of the universe and brings order to chaos. But the true function of language is not revelation, it is reduction. The universe, in its raw form, is a seamless, hyper-complex web of continuous energy, an unbroken field of matter and vibration where nothing is truly separate from anything else. But a brain trapped in a state of raw, unmediated connection with the cosmos would be instantly overwhelmed. To ensure your biological survival, your brain must act as a reducing valve. It must chop the continuous flow of the universe into distinct, manageable fragments. Language is the blade it uses to perform this surgery. When we give something a name, we draw an artificial line around it, separating it from the rest of reality. We pull it out of the infinite field of possibility and freeze it into a fixed, predictable concept. This reduction is harmless when applied to inanimate matter. We point to a specific arrangement of wood and call it a chair, or a specific collection of leaves and call it a tree. The label allows us to navigate the room or find shelter without overanalyzing our environment. But a profound, systemic crisis occurs when we turn this reducing blade inward and attempt to apply it to the infinite expanse of human consciousness. When a child is born, their awareness is wide open, fluid, and non-localized. They do not experience themselves as a separate ego sitting inside a meat suit, looking out at an external world. They experience reality as a unified field of sensations, colors, and movements. They are the light on the wall, the warmth of the skin, the sound of the rain, and the breath in the lungs. They are an uncarved block of pure, unadulterated potential. And then the sorting mechanism begins to vibrate. The adults in the environment begin to project a specific sound wave toward this open field of awareness. They repeat it thousands of times, anchoring it to a specific physical form, a specific set of expectations, and a specific legal status. The child's brain, desperate to adapt and survive within the social matrix, begins to internalize this frequency. It learns to associate the sound of its name with its own physical boundaries. It builds a mental fortress around that specific acoustic signal. In that precise moment, the uncarved block is shattered. The child stops identifying with the infinite field of experience and begins identifying with the label. This identification is the birth of the ego, the psychological construct that isolates us from the rest of existence. By accepting your name, you accept a massive, unspoken contract containing thousands of terms and conditions you never read. You agree to be a specific age, a specific gender, a specific nationality, and the protagonist of a specific, limited life story. You step out of the boundless ocean of consciousness and climb into a tiny, custom-made glass bottle labeled with your initials. This glass bottle is maintained by the constant acoustic reinforcement of your social environment. Every time someone calls your name, they are not just identifying you. They are broadcasting a specific linguistic frequency that commands your nervous system to snap back into its localized, defensive posture. It is a biological trigger. The moment the syllables hit your ear, your brain stem fires, your attention narrows, and your entire psychological architecture instantly adjusts to fit the narrow parameters of the character you have agreed to play. We become completely hypnotized by our own backstories. We forget that before you had a name, you still existed. Before you were handed a gender, a race, a family tree, or a social security number, your consciousness was fully awake, experiencing the raw miracle of presence without needing a single word to justify it. That underlying, nameless awareness has never changed. It is the quiet canvas upon which the story of your named identity is being painted. Yet, because the paint is so bright and the narrative is so loud, we spend our entire lives mistaking the portrait for the living observer. This linguistic cage is further reinforced by the phenomenon of internal vocalization, the voice that speaks inside your head, the restless narrator of your daily anxieties, plans, and regrets, speaks exclusively in the language of your name. It addresses you from the perspective of your localized identity, constantly reviewing your past mistakes and worrying about your future reputation. It keeps the frequency of the cage humming at a steady, uninterrupted pitch throughout your waking life. We find ourselves caught in a profound existential contradiction. We look out at the infinite expanse of the night sky, contemplate the staggering depth of the cosmos, and feel a deep, visceral yearning for boundless freedom. We want to expand, to transcend our limitations, to touch something timeless. Yet the moment we return our attention to our own lives, we collapse our focus back down to the tiny, localized narrative of a single word. We attempt to fit the infinite expanse of the universe into a 4-syllable suitcase. This structural compression of the soul creates a quiet, chronic suffering that shadows modern human life. We feel trapped, disconnected, and burdened by the crushing weight of our own reputations. Yet we have no idea that the prison wall is made of nothing but sound waves and syntax. We are desperate to break free, but how do you escape a cage when you believe that you are the cage? If our names are not passive markers, but active linguistic technologies designed to compress our infinite potential into a manageable social unit, then we must look closer at the hidden mechanics of this frequency. What happens to the human brain when it becomes locked into a single acoustic signature for a lifetime? How does the physics of sound intersect with the architecture of the soul to keep us blind to our own vastness? To fully comprehend the restrictive power of this linguistic seal, we must move beyond psychology and look directly into the physics of resonance. The universe is not a collection of solid, static objects. It is an interconnected tapestry of frequencies. Every molecule, every cell, and every neural network in your body possesses a resonant frequency, a specific rate of vibration at which it naturally oscillates. And nothing shapes the internal vibrational landscape of the human nervous system quite like the human voice. When a word is spoken, it is not an abstract intellectual event. It is a physical kinetic wave. It passes through the air, compresses your eardrum, and sends a rhythmic shock wave through the fluid-filled chambers of your inner ear. This mechanical wave is instantly converted into an electrical torrent that sweeps across the temporal lobes, reverberating through your brain stem and cascading down your spinal cord. This is the phenomenon of cymatics, the study of how sound waves structurally organize matter. If you place sand on a metal plate and blast a specific frequency through it, the chaotic grains will instantly arrange themselves into beautiful, geometric patterns. Raise the frequency, and the pattern becomes more complex. Lower it, and it simplifies. Your name is the ultimate cymatic frequency of your psyche. Every time those specific syllables are broadcast into your field, it is like a tuning fork striking your nervous system. The sound waves physically mold the neural geometry of your brain, forcing your thoughts, your emotional pathways, and your self-perception to organize themselves into a rigid, repeatable structure. Over a lifetime of repetition, this acoustic signature carves deep, unyielding canyons into your gray matter. Your brain becomes structurally tuned to resonate exclusively within the narrow bandwidth of that title. This acoustic programming establishes what modern neuroscientists call a default mode network, a highly integrated web of brain regions that activates when you are not engaged in a specific task. This network is the biological home of your ego. It is where your brain constructs your autobiographical memory, tracks your social status, and maintains your anxious projections of the future. And when researchers observe this network under functional brain imaging, they discover something startling. The default mode network flares into hyperactivity. The millisecond a subject hears their own name, the name acts as an electric fence. The moment you begin to drift away from your localized identity, the moment your mind quietens and begins to touch the spacious, non-local field of pure awareness, someone calls your name. The sound wave hits the brain, the default mode network explodes with activity, and you are instantly yanked back down into the prison of your narrative. The expansive, cosmic observer is violently compressed back into the narrow coordinates of a single, fragile social unit. This mechanical reduction is why we feel a sudden, involuntary jolt of adrenaline when our name is shouted in a public space. It is not just a social reaction, it is a primal somatic reflex. Your brain treats your name as an existential alarm clock, ensuring that you never stay awake to your true, infinite nature for too long. It locks you into a permanent state of psychological confinement, forcing you to defend the reputation, the history, and the limitations of a word that was assigned to you before you could even speak. This artificial localization creates a profound, unexamined psychological conflict within us. Every human being carries an innate, evolutionary drive toward wholeness and expansion. We possess a quiet, persistent intuition that we are fundamentally larger than the lives we are currently leading, that our consciousness is capable of touching states of profound infinity, deep universal love, and timeless wisdom. But the moment we attempt to express this vastness, we encounter the hard boundary of our linguistic cage. We try to articulate an infinite experience using a vocabulary designed entirely for a localized ego. We say, "I am feeling enlightened," or "I am seeking the truth," completely missing the trap hidden within the syntax. The word "I" immediately anchors the discussion back to the named character. It turns a vast, universal phenomenon into a personal achievement for the ego to brag about. Language transforms a liberation from the self into a decoration for the self. This leaves us caught in a frustrating, inescapable loop. We use the very tool of our confinement to search for our freedom. We attempt to think our way out of a prison that is constructed out of thoughts. We polished the bars of the cage, adjusted the lighting within the cell, and called it personal growth. We remain utterly blind to the fact that the true self does not sit inside the name. The true self is the vast, silent awareness within which the name is born, spoken, and eventually forgotten. If this sonic architecture is so deeply embedded within our biology and our social matrix, then the question of liberation becomes a terrifying tightrope. If we were to completely dissolve the frequency of our name, if we were to step entirely outside the boundary of our linguistic title, who would be left to walk through the world? What happens to a human being when the cage is completely dismantled and the infinite self is suddenly forced to confront the the raw, unmediated expanse of its own vastness. To step beyond this acoustic boundary is to venture into a forgotten historical lineage of voluntary exile. Throughout antiquity, across almost every major spiritual and philosophical tradition, those who sought ultimate truth arrived at an identical, radical realization. Before you can find the infinite, you must systematically murder the label. They understood that the name is the linchpin of the societal illusion. This is why, in the ancient monastic and ascetic traditions of both the East and the West, the very first step of initiation was not a theological lecture, but a ceremonial stripping of the name. When a seeker entered the wilderness, the ashram, or the monastery, their birth name was violently discarded. They were handed a new title, or frequently no title at all. This was not a mere symbolic ritual. It was a sophisticated psychological surgery designed to shatter the default mode network. By cutting the cord to the old acoustic frequency, the initiate collapsed the entire legal, familial, and biographical construct that had held their consciousness hostage for decades. The old character died on the doorstep, and the mind was suddenly cast into a vast, terrifyingly open space. In the ancient Greek epic, the Odyssey, this exact linguistic technology is used to escape a monster. When the hero Odysseus is trapped in the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus, a towering, one-eyed beast that represents the raw, unblinking, hyper-focused gaze of primal consumerism and survival, he does not defeat the creature with raw physical strength. Instead, he uses a linguistic camouflage. When the monster demands to know his identity, Odysseus replies with a single word, autis. In ancient Greek, this translates literally to nobody or no name. Later, when Odysseus blinds the monster to escape, the Cyclops screams out to his brethren across the island for help, shouting, "Nobody is killing me by fraud. Nobody is killing me by force." Hearing this, the other giants ignore his cries, assuming he is merely mad or suffering from a divine affliction. By dissolving his name, Odysseus becomes invisible to the predatory sorting mechanisms of the world. He escapes the cave not by being strong, but by becoming unclassifiable. This myth is a precise allegory for our modern existential trap. The world we live in is a ravenous, data-driven cyclops. It demands that you have a name, a fixed profile, a trackable identity, and a predictable brand. It wants to categorize your thoughts, monetize your anxieties, and feed your attention into an algorithmic machine that relies entirely on your localization. The moment you declare yourself to be a specific, named entity, the machine can track you, judge you, and cage you. But when you cultivate the internal capacity to become nobody, when you step out of the frequency of your personal label, the claws of the world lose their grip. This internal dissolution is what modern psychologists call the state of flow, or what mystics refer to as ego death. When an artist is deeply immersed in a masterpiece, when an athlete is operating at the absolute limit of their capability, or when a meditator sinks into deep, unmoving stillness, their name completely vanishes from their conscious awareness. They do not feel like a person named Michael, or Sarah, or David executing an action. The biographical self goes dark. The inner monologue stops its chattering commentary. The anxieties of the past and future dissolve, and there is only the raw, unmediated explosion of the present moment. In these rare, luminous intervals, you are not less than yourself. You are infinitely more. You have temporarily stepped out of the frequency cage and returned to the non-local wilderness of pure consciousness. You are no longer a localized drop of water, desperately trying to defend its boundaries from the rest of the weather. You have remembered that you are the entire ocean. It is a state of unspeakable liberation, a return to the pristine, uncarved block of potential that you were before the world stamped you with a title. Yet, this liberation introduces a profound psychological weight. Human beings have become so addicted to their cages that absolute freedom feels like an existential abyss. If you completely strip away your name, your history, your social status, and your reputation, a deep, primitive panic can set in. The ego looks out at the boundless expanse of its own infinite nature and misinterprets it as death. It scrambles to find a handhold, desperate to hear its familiar frequency spoken aloud by another person, just to confirm that it hasn't floated away into nothingness. We are terrified of being nobody, so we willingly run back to our cages, locking the door from the inside and wrapping our chains tighter around our chests. We find ourselves standing on the precipice of a final, practical dilemma. We cannot simply abandon our names and wander the world as ghosts without legal identities or social utilities. We must live in a world built entirely out of labels. How, then, do we bridge this chasm? How do we hold a name, answer to it in crowded rooms, and navigate the social matrix without allowing that specific acoustic frequency to imprison our infinite self? Navigating this linguistic paradox in the modern world does not require you to legally delete your identity, retreat to an isolated mountaintop, or refuse to sign your lease. Such radical actions are merely the ego staging a dramatic performance of its own enlightenment. True sovereignty does not lie in fighting the cage. It lies in a profound internal shift in how we relate to the lock. We must learn the art of treating our name not as an absolute definition of our soul, but as a practical social costume. In the theater of everyday life, a master actor does not believe they are literally the character whose name is printed on the script. When an actor steps into a dressing room, they pull on a heavy coat, attach a prosthetic scar, and walk out onto the stage answering to a fictitious title. They perform the role with absolute precision, weeping genuine tears and shouting with authentic rage. But deep within the silent, unblinking recess of their awareness, they remain entirely anchored in their true identity. They know that the costume is something they are wearing, not something they are. When the final curtain falls, they can unzip the suit, wash off the makeup, and walk back out into the open air, completely untouched by the wounds of the character. The moment you apply this cinematic distance to your own life, your relationship with reality undergoes a radical, stress-reducing transformation. When you walk into your office, attend a social gathering, or manage the digital profile that carries your name, you are no longer defending your ultimate existential worth. You are simply managing a piece of social technology. When someone critiques your work, insults your reputation, or attacks your name on a glowing digital screen, the emotional sting vanishes. The weapon misses its target because it was aimed at the costume, while the infinite observer remains sitting safely back in the dark auditorium of the mind. You stop taking your own life personally. This psychological buffer completely rewrites how we navigate the modern epidemic of identity crisis and burnout. We live in a hyper-connected digital landscape that demands we constantly curate, optimize, and market our named identities. We turn our names into personal brands, tracking our value through metrics of likes, shares, and institutional validations. This constant self-commodification forces the frequency cage to hum at a deafening, toxic pitch. It creates a state of chronic, agonizing hypervigilance, where the soul feels entirely hollowed out to feed the reputation of the label. But when you reestablish your center of gravity within the nameless witness, you break the cycle of this exhaustion. You realize that your value as a living consciousness is completely independent of the success or failure of the character you are playing. The name can stumble, the character can make mistakes, and the social costume can get torn into pieces by the critics. Yet the pristine canvas of your underlying presence remains entirely untarnished. You gain the freedom to treat your life as a grand, playful experiment rather than a desperate struggle for validation. This perspective grants you a profound, creative flexibility. Most people are paralyzed by a deep, subconscious fear of changing their lives because they believe they are permanently locked into the specific role they have played for decades. They think, I am an accountant, I am a pragmatist, I am someone who doesn't take risks. They mistake their habituated neural canyon for their absolute nature. But when you recognize that your name is just a collection of syllables and your identity is just a script written by your past, you realize you have the power to change the channel. You can step out of the genre of tragedy or isolation, adjust the dialogue, and experiment with entirely new ways of being. You can play the role of the explorer, the artist, or the healer without needing anyone's permission to do so. We begin to understand that the label is not an anchor designed to drag us down into the mud of localization. It is a diving suit that allows an infinite, non-local consciousness to temporarily plunge into the dense, beautiful, and messy ocean of human experience. The suit is necessary to feel the heat of the fire, the sting of grief, and the exquisite joy of connection. The mistake was never wearing the suit. The mistake was forgetting that we have the power to take it off. As we master this fluid dance between the boundless observer and the bounded persona, we find ourselves standing on the threshold of the final, most intimate revelation of the frequency cage. If your personal name is merely a superficial label designed to isolate you from the rest of the universe, what happens when we look past the individual titles of everyone around us? What is the true, unspoken name of the singular, infinite consciousness that is currently looking out through 8 billion pairs of human eyes? We spend our entire existence shouting our names into the dark, desperate to leave a permanent echo in a world that is constantly shifting beneath our feet. We build empires of digital data, carve our signatures into stone monuments, and force our children to carry our titles forward, all to convince ourselves that our localized identity matters to the cold, silent mechanics of the cosmos. We treat our names as a shield against the absolute void of our own insignificance. Yet, this frantic struggle for individual permanence is entirely based on a profound misunderstanding of the architecture. The frequency cage of your name was never meant to be a permanent monument. It was a temporary lens, a brilliant piece of cosmic stagecraft designed to let the infinite experience the magnificent beauty of limitation. The universe did not fracture its awareness into 8 billion separate human beings so that they could sit in isolated silos, defending their private labels until they die. It fractured itself so that it could experience the unspeakable joy of meeting itself from an infinite number of different angles. Your name is the specific coordinate where the universe has chosen to sit down and watch its own creation play out. And when the final curtain falls on the character you are playing, when the electrical currents of your brain slow down and the acoustic signature of your label finally fades back into the silence, nothing is lost. The glass bottle does not shatter into a terrifying abyss. It simply dissolves back into the boundless ocean from which it was filled. The individual drop of water realizes it was never an isolated entity struggling against the weather. It was the entire storm all along. The fear of being forgotten vanishes, replaced by the profound, timeless recognition that you have always been the only consciousness that ever existed. You are the speaker, the listener, the singer, and the quiet silence that drinks in the music. We walk through the world with our eyes wide open, searching for meaning in the pages of our personal biographies, completely blind to the fact that the true name of the self cannot be written on a piece of paper or spoken by a human throat. It cannot be compressed into a rigid combination of acoustic syllables or tracked by an algorithmic sorting machine. Right here, in the middle of your ordinary, noisy, and unfinished day, you can step past the walls of your frequency cage. You can listen to the chattering voice of your inner monologue, hear the syllables of your label being spoken in the streets, and simply smile at the beauty of the costume. You don't need to change your title, protect your reputation, or fix the character on the stage. The play is running, the sound waves are vibrating, and the illusion is beautiful. And the moment you remember the nameless vastness inside you, you can finally put down the pen, step out of the cage, and listen to the silent symphony of your own infinite presence.